Movements to End Violence Against Women. Alicia Heinrichs, Philosophy 361. Susan Reuter, Buena Vista University. Violence against women is a problem that remains hidden. The concept is to remain free from battering, harassment, and sexual assault may seem hard to imagine. However, it remains a part of culture and life. It is a violation of human rights. What is violence against women? It's a multitude of abuses directed at women and girls over the lifespan. It includes threats of violence or coercion in public or private life, and it is any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women. In layman's terms, this basically means that any act that causes or could potentially cause violence to a woman is violence against women. It also is defined as a term that portrays masculinity as being superior to femininity. The causes of violence against women are the perpetrators. They are the only cause for violence. There is no excuse or reason as to why a woman should have violence in their life. There are a multitude of conditions that could cause a perpetrator to cause violence against women. Cultural mores, religious practices, economical and political conditions may set the precedents for initiating and perpetrating violence, but ultimately committing an act of violence is a choice that an individual makes out of a range of options. Perpetrators usually seek power and control over their victims, yet there is still no justification for violence against women. The number one effect of violence against women is poor women's health. Along with that is physical, psychological, spiritual, emotional well-being, social, and economical effects. The victim pays the consequences, not just mentally and physically, but reproductively and sexually. Injuries can include suicide, depression, gynecological problems, and disabilities, whether temporary or permanent. And those are just to name a few. Typically, victims do not recognize the severity of the abuse in the beginning. In most situations, the abuse is usually harmless at first, and then over time it gradually gets worse. It may occur more in severity and occur more frequently as time goes on. Victims tend to adapt to abusive behavior, and then the verbal and psychological tactics can gain a strong foothold in victims' minds, and it makes it difficult for them to recognize the severity of the abuse over time. Okay, now the statistics. More than 2.5 million women experience violence annually. That's a very large number. An estimated 6.2 million women are victims of domestic and intimate partner violence. Domestic and intimate partner violence are the most frequently occurred violence against women. The statistics are outraging, and with the increasing number of women's movements over the years, violence against women is being recognized as a social problem. However, the numbers should be decreasing, but it is statistically proven that it is not. According to the National Crime Victims Survey, or NCVS, 3 out of 4 female victims of violence resisted the actions of the offender either physically or verbally. Nearly half the victims of rape had perceived the offender to have been under the influence of drugs and/or alcohol at the time of the offense. About a third of female victims of violence were injured as a result of the crime, and about half the women victimized by violence reported the crime to police, and among those who didn't, about 6 in 10 said they considered the matter a private or personal one, or they felt the offense was minor. it is important to keep in mind that no violent offense is minor. While researching, I found some survivor stories, and it was found on the Women Against Abuse website. One story is about a violent survivor named Kathleen. She had gotten married, and her husband held control over her in the beginning, but it started out slow. Eventually, her husband moved her away, and her husband isolated her from her friends and family. She had a great career, worked every day, and enjoyed her career. However, her husband called her a bad mother for having a career and not staying home with the kids. She eventually dropped her career and decided to be a stay-at-home mom, but it still didn't please her husband. Eventually, her husband brutally attacked her, leaving her with a severe concussion. After she went to the hospital, she did not realize what had happened to her because of the concussion, but she received help from a social worker immediately while she was in the hospital. She told her story, and this is a typical circumstance that surrounds a lot of women that are in an abusive marriage. Okay, now on to the history of violence against women. Going back to 753 BC, which is the earliest I could find for information on the web, wife beating was condoned during this time, and it was known as disciplining the wife. This was more known through the church rather than brought on by society itself. From 900 to 1300, wives were beat on a regular basis, and this was the norm. In the 1400s, men encouraged to provide punishment in moderation. So the church basically said that it was okay for men to still provide punishment and beat their wives, but only to a certain extent. And then in the 1500s, men were still allowed to kill their wives, and there was no punishment for it. And then in the 1600s, women started fighting back by killing their husbands. In Russia at that time, they would bury their husbands alive with their heads sticking out of the ground and basically punish them back for all the violence that they had inflicted on them. In the 1700s, a woman who committed domestic violence on her lesbian partner was sentenced to death. However, they did not sentence men to death for committing domestic violence at that time. In the 1800s, wife beating was recognized as a crime in several states for the first time. However, there were still many states that didn't recognize it as a crime and condoned punishment of the wife. In the 1900s, inflicting injury on a wife is deemed a felony in the court of law. This happened over time, and eventually the Violence Against Women Act was passed in 1994, and the current statistics are showing that abuse is increasing rather than decreasing. Okay, now prevention. Prevention of violence against women. So the first step in preventing violence against women starts with engaging communities. Once communities become engaged, objectives need to be met. The first objective is to take a look at gender roles. When taking a look at gender roles, men and women alike need to understand that violence does not allow a person to achieve full humanity. Secondly, if childhood sex abuse can be prevented, violence against women is less likely to occur. And that's because if childhood violence doesn't occur, it is less likely that it will occur as an adult. And thirdly, community-centered strategies that are developed with the help in the prevention of violence against women. Communities can provide legal approaches and prevention services, However, this is not enough. It is very pertinent that community members get involved in the fight of violence against women. And this is how violence could end someday. Ending violence against women is a daunting task that will take generations to achieve. Well, we've come a long way over the years, and that's shown especially with the act that was passed in 1994. However, we still have a long ways to go, and it's very disturbing that our country has seen an increase in violence against women. The statistics are there to prove it, and hopefully, if more people take a stand and communities come together, the end to violence against women will come in the future, and hopefully soon.